Do your research. This is like,
Here's how I'm going to target. How should I target? I'm going to figure that out.
How you doing?
That's every time.
So it should be HDMI and VGA there. I think the HDMI is probably your best bet. You got slides. You got any sound?
Just at one bit, yeah.
Okay, so it should work. If it doesn't, you can always unplug and just play the sound. It does carry somewhat well. Probably, maybe not. But if you want to test it, you can test it now. And we can see about making it work.
Strategy.
All right, I think that's working now.
Hear you talk, I always feel smart. I don't know what that Lucas is.
It's not.
I mean, very nice, like most talks.
Is it playing on your?
More about the board game industry, how the shipping works, but I don't work in board games.
Do you need presentation?
Yeah, it's in presentation mode.
There's drop
The space bar is not working too.
None of it was working, but I think we should just get used to it.
Got it. Do you move around a lot? You gonna?
I don't know, Wes. I could do the clicker if you have one, but if not,
I do not.
don't worry, I'll just
Sorry,
try
I don't
and
think so anyway.
not move around too much.
Some of them have them, some of them not. Yeah, you know, there's a lot, it's for the big math.
Yeah.
There's a lot of math that happens. Well, you have 16 people currently watching online as well. That's up 4 from a minute ago. Must be very excited. Give them like a minute, 2 to come from the other ones. And cool. 19 viewers now. So what is Saratoga 1777?
It's what I think it is. It's probably an hour talk now.
Alright. So this is all set up and it's just going to run. I'll come back and check on it in a few. Just got to go check on the other streams, make sure they're going.
Okay.
You can start whenever you
I'm all
want.
set?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Live is
Hmm?
You can hear me, I'm speaking, and it's, yeah. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me, thank you for showing up. This is a 30-minute talk on battles, simulations of the Saratoga Campaign, or the 2 key battles that were part of that. Specifically, it's about board game simulations, and I'm going to do a really quick run-through of the background history and a quick run-through of all the games that are being published in this area, and then a really quick run-through of what I've been up to and how I've been trying to do something a bit different. So really quickly, who am I? I'm Maurice Suckling. I'm a professor of practice at RPI, it's upstate New York. I teach the writing concentration there and some courses on board games and storytelling systems, and looking to do a course on historical simulations this summer. I'm now in my 3rd year teaching that. Before that, I spent 20 years in the video game industry, making games for consoles and PC titles mostly. My first game was a game called Driver back in 1999, and since then I have over 40 published game credits. More recently, I was narrative director at 2K Australia, where we made Borderlands the pre-sequel and some DLC, and I was narrative designer at the Imaginati Studios, where we made Planet of the Apes Last Frontier, and I'm also working on this indie title, narrative-driven game called Lost Words. It's out later this year. Simultaneously, I've been keeping alive a lifelong love of war games and board games, converting that into a global history master's in Birmingham University. I'm starting to publish in academic journals and research board games libraries like this one at the Western Library in Oxford, and I have a card game in development with publishers Victory Point Games. So what was the research question driving this? How might I design a game that attempts some kind of simulation of the military situation at Saratoga in 1777 that feels different from pre-existing games on the subject, plays for about an hour, and is relatively easy to learn? Just a really quick note on the difference between a game and a simulation. A game is for entertainment, a simulation has evaluative or computational purposes. Since a lot of the games I'm talking about call themselves simulation games, it's a bit like saying one is blue and the other is a different kind of blue, but I don't want to pretend that the extreme ends of that spectrum there isn't a real and important distinction to make. It's just not something I'm going to do now, talk about. I'm going to talk about a bit of history. So it's customary when talking about Saratoga to call it a turning point. Pretty much everyone does that. Dean Snow, in this fantastic recent release, reminded us we could also call it a tipping point, but mostly everyone's decided it's a turning point. Wherever you go, everyone says it's a turning point, and Library of Congress says it's a turning point. So it would take an extremely brave historian to say something like this, but in fact, Corbett's point is that in upstate New York, not a lot of things changed. It was still in tremendous flux, and it was still extremely pleasant for the people, unpleasant for the people living there at the time. But globally speaking, I don't know any historians who seriously dispute this view by Piers Magazine, amongst many others, this 1964 publication. He said the defeat at Saratoga is the clearest turning point of the war and marked the beginning of a general war waged throughout the world. So 1775, the clashes at Lexington and Concord, and then later at Bunker Hill, meant that this was clearly a serious insurrection. The fledgling Congress launched an invasion of Canada later that year to try and persuade the Canadians at gunpoint that they too could be just as free as the colonies if they chose to. They demurred with the help of British regulars, and the American attack broke down, was somewhat secured. The strategic situation was somewhat stabilized by Benedict Arnold, whose victory at Valcourt Island meant that the Americans held on to the critical Fort Ticonderoga. 76, 77 was also pretty miserable for the rebellion in New York and New Jersey. Washington suffered a series of serious defeats at the hands of General Howe, and only his audacious victories at Trenton and Princeton helped stabilize the situation for him. Early 1777, this guy, John Burgoyne, with an eye on a command in America, pitched this three-army junction plan to Lord George Germain, the minister who was essentially running the war in London, whereby this three-army junction would occur in Albany, an army all the way down from Montreal, another army through the Mohawk Valley, and one coming up from New York. Take Albany, decapitate the colonies, and sever lines of communication. That plan was approved a bit later that year. A few weeks later, William Howe, this general, decided he wasn't going to do that. He was going to, in fact, attack Philadelphia, go via the Chesapeake Bay, and that Burgoyne didn't really need his help. Burgoyne didn't know this at the time. This became a huge problem. Certainly one of the most contentious things from the strategic side for the British was how all of this happened. There's a lot to say about it. I don't have time to talk about it now, but it's worth bearing in mind it's over 3,000 miles between Montreal and London. Contemporary maritime technology, winds and tides, so on, meant that it's about a month west to east and about 3 times that east to west, meaning that the chances of communication orders getting confused was pretty high. Anyway, by July 16th, Burgoyne had taken Fort Ticonderoga. He got as far as Fort Edward. He waited for his supplies. There's a long and tenuous supply line coming from Canada. And that gave this guy, General Gates, a British-born general who was formerly a British general in the British Army, time that he needed to consolidate forces around Stillwater, and this time ended up actually being critical for the American cause. August saw a couple of big American victories, first at Bennington, and then this guy again, the ever-energetic Benedict Arnold at Fort Stanwix, relieving all of this British pressure along the Mohawk Valley. Burgoyne and Gates, their armies came face to face September 19th. A bloody Pyrrhic victory for the British meant that they secured the field, but Burgoyne's army was pretty mangled and he couldn't really do much about that. Then there was a period of interlude where Burgoyne was trying to figure out, and mostly failing, what the situation was with Howe. Howe had left this guy, General Clinton, in charge of a handful of troops in New York, but they weren't really going to be that effective. Around about September 20th, this letter arrived Clinton sent this letter to Burgoyne. It came in a cipher form. You can see those letters those words in bold are the ones that the cipher would reveal when you put the cardboard sheet over it, and thanks to Dean Snow for this. Basically saying, Hal's gone to the Chesapeake, it's a disaster, I'm going to do whatever I can, but it won't be an awful lot. Burgoyne, in fact, chose to see this as a reason to stick around. Perhaps he shouldn't have. It meant that the two forces consolidated their fortifications, but while the American forces were getting stronger and the militia were congregating, things were going worse for Burgoyne, desertions and supplies becoming a real problem. Then we have the second Saratoga, a British foray into across American lines turned into a retreat, turned into a full-scale counterattack and the British withdrawal. Burgoyne couldn't ever really outrun the Americans and ended up surrendering shortly after that, and with huge ramifications globally. It's worth remembering the British and they ended up not really just fighting the Americans, they fought the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the Mysoreans in India, and with the Russians declaring neutrality, it meant that the British were pretty much fighting entirely on their own, barring a couple of minor states in Germany, but they were mercenaries anyway, so it was hard going for the British. This whole dimension has been somewhat neglected, I think, particularly in the States, which is a shame, but there's a Smithsonian exhibition going on right now that's addressing this angle, and that's a publication that comes off the back of it, and I think it's a really fascinating part of this whole era. Anyway, to talk about the existing games, published games, I'm going to say there have been 9 published games between 1974 and 2017. I'm going to say there are 9 because I'm excluding republished or reprinted games, excluding scenarios inside other games, so things like the Hold the Line series, for example, excluding aspects of the campaign inside other games, things like We the People, I suppose you could say, you can simulate Saratoga through that, excluding self-published games, and excluding tabletop rules, mostly for miniatures. And there are at least 2 games in this area that are in development that I'm aware of, and that's excluding my own. Here's a really quick rundown. So basically the green means I've played it, the pink means I haven't played it yet, in bold means it's in print. You can see most of these are out of print, and the BGG rating is the Board Game Geek rating, Board Game Geek being the sort of central repository for the industry and the hobby at large. I'm going to say something about each of these really quickly. Burgoyne versus Gates has this point-to-point movement, not a hex in sight. You move from key town to key town. Has full visibility, meaning I can see all the unit strengths of every piece on the board at all times. And mostly full responsiveness. So mostly if I want a unit to do something, it goes and does it. There's a force march mechanic, which means that's slightly modified, but nevertheless, that's what we have there. Those things are in red, because I'm going to come back and talk about those quickly in a moment. Battle of Saratoga, Oldenburg, Grenadiers, hex grid clearly, full visibility, again I can see everything, partial responsiveness, this sort of unusual mechanic whereby randomly some units become disorganized, which makes handling them problematic, but kind of interesting. Birth of a Nation, hex grid, full visibility, full responsiveness, DRMs, die roll modifiers, usual kind of war game stuff that we see pretty often. This game, Saratoga, maybe by GMT, maybe one of the most well-known ones. Hex grid, full visibility, but a partial responsiveness element. So you roll off against each other for initiative, and it means you could end up having 2 turns back to back, which has all sorts of interesting ramifications. This game, Turning Point, published by two different publishers over the years, but square grid, and it has, if you're familiar with the Command and Colors games, you can see it's the same designer, Richard Berg, but has this constraints built around the cards you have in your hand, which makes things kind of intriguing as you try and battle your way through this system as much as anything. Line in a Net, I don't really know much about this. I found it online, I can't get hold of it, it's out of print. I'm still trying to learn more about it. Saratoga, 1777 AD by Turning Point Games, has a hex grid, full visibility, but also this sort of partial responsiveness mechanic whereby if units come out of a command radius, then I have to put a little token on them saying they're out of command, and it's hard to move them. It's kind of fiddly in terms of implementation, but in terms of concept, I thought that was rather intriguing. And this first Saratoga Burgoyne's Gambit, again, a pretty standard, conventional format, mostly full responsiveness. There's just a fog modifier that has minor implications. And finally, this game, Saratoga, 1777. This is the only other one, bar that Burgoyne versus Gates, that focuses on the campaign as a whole. Has point-to-point. It's a block game, so I don't know if you know what they are, but it means that you can't see the details of your opponent's units, but you can see where they are. You just don't see the face. You keep those details to yourself, and also has this activation point system, which means that it's randomly generated. It means it's difficult to be sure that you're going to get troops to where you want them to go in the time that you want them to go, and also has this battle sort of extracted map, rather like the Columbia Games Waterloo, where you dice off against each other and you roll a certain number of dice and you get hits, and if you take a hit, you rotate that block around until it ends up with no points and it's removed from the game. Anyway, so quickly to my design intentions. Did I want it to be Freeman's Farm? Did I want it to be Bemis Heights? Did I want to combine them in the way that Saratoga, the GMT game, did? Or did I want the full campaign like those other two games I just was mentioning? Well, I didn't know. I was going to come back to that. I knew I wanted no hex or square grid. Maybe that meant area control, or maybe point to point. What's my problem with hexes? Mathematically, yes, they're useful. Squares have a longer distance across the diagonal, so hexes fix that problem. But I've never been that keen on the look. That Saratoga by GMT does look nice, but that's more of an exception rather than a rule. In any case, cardboard counters, when they look top down, maybe they look fine or maybe good, but from the side, they tend to look not that interesting. And in any case, the sort of conventional 19th century battle maps that I think you're probably all accustomed to, those sort of top-down ones, I think generally look rather beautiful, and they seem more interesting to me. And I also think that the hex grids are sort of deeply encoded with modifiers, which makes things, slows the game down, and it doesn't make me feel like I'm making high-level decisions, command decisions. In fact, I saw these views echoed in this wonderful collection, Zones of Control, published by MIT Press, and a particular chapter in that by Rachel Simmons, in which she was pretty much saying the same kinds of things that I felt, but perhaps more eloquently. And she also was saying she was coming to think of a game like a machine to translate the player's decisions into physical reality. An important measure of the quality of the machine was its efficiency. The path between intent and reality should be as short and direct as possible, and I really rather like that. I also felt as if hexes were maybe, these hex grids were maybe a turn-off for more mainstream gamers. They maybe see them and think, oh, it's a war game, and count me out, that's not for me. I think that's a shame when there are so many things that we can do inside a war game. I also didn't want full visibility of unit capability, so maybe that meant a block game, or maybe it meant something else. What's my problem with this? It's a convention that's well understood. It's the same for both players. You can see everything, and so can they. But it doesn't make me feel like I'm simulating history, and I think we can do better. At least block games mask the full capability of what those units are, but is there nothing newer we can explore? Maybe I can see units, and depending on the era this makes sense, depending on the scale, but don't know the full extent of their capacity to hurt me and to keep hurting me. That felt like an idea I wanted to do something with. And I also wanted no full responsiveness. What's my problem with this? It's certainly risky to design player inability into something that they want to do. But if all units always did what commanders wanted, and commanders could see everything that was happening at the time, most military history, in fact most of history I suggest, would be extremely different. So maybe managing units and managing expectations should be more what we try and model. I knew I was after something that should simulate high-level command decisions then, strategy, playing the odds, opportunism, riding your luck, maybe some adaptive strategy, with some interesting decisions for both sides. I didn't want just one side to have all the stuff, all the interesting stuff to do. Some historical flavour, some tactical elements, have replayability, and not be fiddly, no complex DRMs, die roll modifiers, checking tables, and checking 105 modifiers before you can roll the dice. No step changes and out-of-command tokens. I wanted it to be concentrating on the fun element with a target of about an hour, and I wanted it to be easy to learn. So in terms of research, well, yes, obviously I played these games and thought a bit about why Saratoga is so interesting for historians and military historians. A lot of counterfactuals that people are engaged with. What if Arnold hadn't persuaded Gates to release him on the American left? Would the British have outflanked them? What if the British had brought their powerful artillery into the battle? What if the Germans hadn't saved the British centre? Would Burgoyne have retreated in good order? What if Burgoyne had attacked the very next morning when the Americans were almost out of ammunition? Although Burgoyne didn't know that, nor did most Americans, including Gates. Anyway, all of these sort of interesting counterfactuals that were in my mind, and I was obviously playing some of these games, and I went to the National Historical Park, walked around, took some photos, enjoyed the old school map, had myself a bit of a reflection about the brutal chaos of humanity, and was just generally glad I wasn't here about 250 years before. Obviously did some reading, and then started thinking about this game. One of the big questions is, what do I want to do? Did I want to focus on the campaign? Did I want to focus on one of the battles? I was particularly interested in the relationship between the Saratoga Campaign and the Philadelphia Campaign, but I decided, as with screenwriting, same with my particular process here, keep it simple, stupid, as they say. I wanted to just focus on something simple. I knew I was going to try and do something different anyway, so I didn't want to try and do too much. In any case, a few weeks ago, I discovered this game is in development. Campaigns in 1777, designed by Harold Buchanan. He's also the designer of the well-regarded Liberty or Death game, and I got talking to him, and he sent me the rules and the board and so on. And yes, he is exploring this relationship, and I'm glad that I decided not to do that, because I'm sure he'll do an excellent job. Anyway, I decided I was going to focus on just Freeman's Farm, and I needed to think about, well, one of the first things I think about is how to win, and my first thought was just and my second thought was I don't know, so I knew I needed to come back to that anyway, but I wanted to think about units then and how they worked. How do I stop full unit capabilities being visible to the other player? Maybe block games, but as I said, I don't think that's new, but certainly been popular since the 70s. What if unit capabilities were held inside cards but not shown to an opponent, was one of the ideas. What if the focus wasn't so much on capabilities as on when these units are activated, and perhaps by formations, brigades rather than battalions, to keep the numbers not too fiddly. So sort of maybe there are 5 or 6 formations that you're controlling rather than that number being 3 or 4 times that. So again, my thought went back to this. My thoughts went back to this game and the way that formations were activated there, but the implementation being rather messy. I thought about this game, a war game system developed by my old war games group in Oxford in the UK. That's us playing Leipzig there. Has a lot of modifiers and rather too complex for what I was after, but nevertheless, even here, just moving a unit means that I have to roll dice. I'm not sure that I'll be able to do it when so much of battle simulation or simulation games are about coordinating attacks. This demonstrates how tricky that can be and how you can fall on your face as you try and pull off something more adventurous. And Command and Colours, which you may be familiar with, as I said, I referenced it with the Turning Point game, has this constraint of things that you can do based on the cards in your hand. Here it's to do with the battlefield sector and how that works. In particular, I was thinking of this game, W1815, a beautiful little game that is ultra Kriegspiel. Like, you simply choose one of these formations that you have, or in this game, essentially core. That's the scale that they use, and you do one of the things on the cards, very limited options, and you roll a die or two, and you remove units from the enemy, or you remove morale, or maybe both, and then within 20 minutes your army's broken, or the enemy army is broken, and you've won. Felt to me like there was real potential in this, and we could do far more with this sort of system, the door that these guys had opened up, and that it was something I wanted to try and develop. I was also thinking of this game. This is Napoleon's Trump. This is by Rachel Simmons, I was talking about earlier, and I like the aesthetics of this. Someone was talking earlier about how much aesthetics drive things. That, for me, was very much the case, and certainly it's the case for Rachel Simmons. And to a lesser extent, there are these command post games that have a similar aesthetic. These play more like miniature games, tabletop games, but nevertheless, there was something in that too. So I knew what I wanted to do. It was time to draw a map and make, unfortunately, an ugly map, and then time to try and make it a bit prettier as I was starting to understand how this design was perhaps working. I don't have a lot of time to really talk about a lot of things here. I will just call out a few things. So with morale, it's quite often in war games, particularly tabletop games, there's a familiar pattern to them, whether it's sort of you move and you fight and you take damage, inflict damage, and you check morale. I was interested in this idea of what if morale was expended? So you have to spend it in order to move or fight or do anything, making it more like a resource that you managed, maybe perhaps influenced by some Euro games. I'm not sure in particular which ones they might be, but maybe that was what was going on. What I liked about this as well was that it gave a game a way to ramp towards a conclusion. It basically allowed you to hard code a climax into the way that the game was going to work. The more you did stuff, the more frangible your units became, the more likely they were to just not be interested in staying around. And I remembered that there was a Wars of the Roses game system that I worked on a few years ago, didn't really end up doing much with, where I'd explored this idea and it started to feel like I was onto something, and so I sort of lifted it partly into that game design. I want to say a bit about friction. Von Clausewitz on war said a couple of interesting things about it. Everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. The difficulties accumulate and end by producing a kind of friction. This tremendous friction is everywhere in contact with chance and brings about effects that cannot be measured, just because they are largely due to chance. Moreover, every war is rich in unique episodes. The good general must know friction in order to overcome it whenever possible, and in order not to expect a standard of achievement in his operations which this very friction makes impossible. So just because you've got your troops in the right place and you know exactly how they work and you understand the terrain doesn't mean that things are going to work out exactly as you plan. This is something that wargame designers have looked at in a number of ways, trying to model, often by dice or by cards or perhaps a combination, or sometimes by neither, and using human psychology to do that. I was interested in the idea of perhaps doing dice and cards in this case. I was particularly thinking about this game, King of Tokyo, which in itself is in some ways a riff off of some Yahtzee mechanics, and I liked this idea of just using dice and re-rolls and strategically thinking about the way that you kind of use these re-rolls. And you're probably familiar with the central limit theorem, which is for designers really a win-win. Essentially, the more dice involved, the more things tend towards an average. So mathematically it makes sense, it helps with your modifiers, but also rolling dice is fun. So obviously there are limits, but essentially using this idea, it meant that when I was in development, I realized mostly my problem was I didn't actually have enough dice. There are more things to say, but I'm really short of time. So in particular, there's this idea of tactics cards and this idea of momentum, these sort of chips, effectively a game currency that lets you buy these tactics cards, or in fact re-roll by spending them, that maybe is one of the newer things that I'm doing in this game. Anyway, round about now I was ready to think about how to win, and maybe this was by location objectives, or maybe by the destruction of an opposing army. I decided to look at, well, what was the reality of the situation? The truth was that the British had to destroy the American army, or effectively they would lose, so I took that, pretty much lifted that from history, if you like. And for the Americans, they just have to survive, or they can destroy the British army. Either way, they will win. So I had a prototype, and it was starting to play okay, and then it was time to send it off to a publisher. And these are my conclusions then. This was my research question: how might I design a game that attempts some kind of simulation of the military situation? Does it feel different? Somewhat. I mean, yes, it's clearly inspired by other games, but I feel as if perhaps in combination, those things maybe feel different. Relatively easy to learn, I think so. We're going to find out as it gets more playtesting. Is it fun? Well, there's chance and there's strategy, and the tactics cards mean that it ends up seeming like it's pretty replayable. Does it simulate? I mean, yeah, somewhat. There are key hinge points. The British attack on the American left is critical. The way that if the British can get their artillery into the fight, that will make a difference, but it's hard for them to do that. In terms of where next then, I am using some of this research to help me with a paper on how board games function as experiential historiography. So what I mean by that is the way in which a design is, by very nature of a design, it's actually saying something, it has a historical viewpoint. So it might not be something that designers necessarily consciously wanted to say, but they are inherently saying it by the nature of the way that they've concocted their design. I said I approached the publisher. I approached just one, in fact, Worthington Games, who got rather excited about it and sent me a map that they played about with, sent me a contract, which I signed, sent me a box cover art, and they sent me a link because this game will be going to Kickstarter soon. And so really short of time, but you can see there's some of the early concepts are coming in now. Some of the cards, and Mike and Grant and Mark have done a fantastic job there trying to sort of communicate this stuff visually. As I said, the visual quality of this was so paramount for me. I think I just about have time to show you a video. Okay, so that's it. Any questions? I know we're really short of time and there's people coming in here in a second. You can find out, you can contact me on Twitter, or there's my email address, or there's Worthington, and also Victory Point Games you can stay in touch with. Any questions here? Thank you. Thank you. I think we have someone at 4:30.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Good job staying within 30 minutes.
See what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. You had 34 people on the stream watching,
Okay.
which is